chamber was packed so tightly that even the air seemed to stand still. Cameras perched like hawks along the back wall, their red lights blinking as millions at home leaned toward their screens. A congressional seal gleamed above the witness table, throwing off reflections as if the room itself were waiting for a spark. At the center sat Representatives Jasmine Crockett and Nancy Mace, separated by only a few feet of polished wood, but divided by a canyon of belief. The hearing on racial equity programs had started like so many before it, procedural voices, polite nods, but beneath the decorum pulsed a nervous current. Commentators were already live tweeting, speculating on which lawmaker might ignite the morning's headlines. From the first gavel strike, the crowd sensed that today would not be routine. Mace adjusted her microphone, lips curling into a practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Across from her, Crockett rested her hands lightly on a folder, calm and unreadable. Every detail of her posture suggested quiet resolve. Shoulders squared, gaze steady, as if she'd measured the storm and decided she could weather it. A rustle swept the room when Mace began to speak, her voice edged with the confidence of someone who had rehearsed every syllable. She dismissed woke programs as an expensive distraction, the kind that teach children to see oppression where none exists. The words sharpened the tension until it felt like glass underfoot. A photographer's shutter snapped, echoing in the hush. Crockett didn't flinch. Her eyes tracked Mace with a stillness that seemed to slow time. Viewers at home felt the pull. Something was about to happen, something that might reorder the debate entirely. She inhaled once, deliberate and calm, fixing Mace with a look that hinted at an answer powerful enough to leave the chamber speechless. The hearing had been billed as a sober review of how federal programs address racial inequity. But the moment the agenda was read aloud, it was clear the room carried more than policy on its shoulders. Lawmakers from every corner of the country filled the panel, their expressions stiff with anticipation. Advocates and reporters lined the back rows, pens ready, knowing that today's discussion was not just about funding formulas or outreach statistics. It was about the story America tells itself about fairness. At the center of that table sat Representative Nancy Mace, fingers laced before her, voice steady but edged with an almost theatrical bite. She opened with a declaration that set the tone like a match dropped on dry grass. Critical race theory, she argued, was a taxpayer-funded guilt trip designed to shame white children for sins they never committed. Her words cut across the space, stirring quiet nods from some and tightening jaws from others. For a moment, the debate seemed to tilt, as if everyone present had been pulled onto the same narrow wire. Mace leaned into the microphone, building her case around a narrative of excess. Federal dollars poured into workshops, lessons, training sessions, all of them, she claimed, pushing an ideology that divided rather than united. She spoke of parents writing to her office, worried that their kids were being taught to see themselves as villains. Her voice carried the sharp rhythm of a practiced litigator, each sentence clipped, leaving just enough air for the cameras to catch the tension in the room. Across the table, Jasmine Crockett listened without interruption. Her stillness wasn't passivity, it was study, a quiet collecting of every syllable. She knew that behind Mace's argument stretched a familiar story, that conversations about privilege were dangerous because they threatened comfort, because they named truths too often left in shadow. To Crockett, the hearing was more than a policy review. It was a test of whether truth could survive in an arena built to blunt its edges. As Mace spoke on, her rhetoric widened. She claimed that identity politics were eroding national pride, that programs meant to level the field were sowing resentment among working families. What we need, she said, is unity, not lectures about privilege. The phrase landed with weight, drawing a murmur from the gallery. Unity, Crockett thought, demanded honesty first. Without it, the word was just a polished shield. Reporters bent over their notes, sensing a narrative forming. A clash not only of policy but of vision, of what America owed its children, clarity or comfort. In that quiet before the next speaker, the stakes crystallized. This was not a hearing about line items in a budget. It was a reckoning over whether the nation could face the uneven ground beneath its own promise. Crockett glanced down at her papers, then back up at Mace, the corners of her mouth composed in a line that gave nothing away. She knew the exchange ahead would draw a line clear enough for everyone to see. The room leaned forward, waiting for the next spark to leap. The hum of side conversations faded as Nancy Mace shifted forward in her seat, her chair scraping softly against the polished floor. She adjusted her microphone with deliberate calm, but there was a glint in her eyes that signaled a sharper edge. Her opening salvo had been pointed, yet what came next felt heavier, as if she had decided that subtlety would no longer serve her cause. The committee room stilled, everyone sensing the moment before a storm. She began by reciting a string of grievances, speaking of constituents tired of what she called a culture of apology. Her words built like stones stacked one on another, framing a picture of hardworking families who, she claimed, were being scolded simply for existing. The narrative drew a thin smile from a few on her side of the aisle, but others watched warily, measuring the temperature of the room. Even the clerks paused over their notes, pens hovering in midair. Then Mace's voice hardened, losing the sheen of practiced neutrality. She leaned closer to the microphone, fingers curled against the desk, and delivered a line that cut through the quiet like glass. "You people always act like America owes you something." The phrase landed with an audible thud. A few gasps slipped from the gallery. Someone's phone chimed, capturing the exact moment for an audience beyond the walls. Staffers exchanged glances, their faces a mix of disbelief and calculation, already imagining the headlines spinning out across social feeds. The words carried more than a personal jab. They echoed an old refrain that many in the room had heard in different forms throughout their lives. For those who knew the history of these debates, the sting was familiar. The suggestion that asking for fairness was an act of ingratitude, that nomming injustice meant you didn't deserve belonging. The tension rippled outward, stirring a low murmur along the press bench as reporters tapped furious notes, thumbs racing across phone screens to send breaking alerts. Crockett remained motionless, her gaze fixed squarely on Mace. She felt the weight of the remark press against her chest, not just as an insult but as a test, a dare to retreat into anger or silence. Instead, she let the silence settle, allowing the room to hear its own discomfort. The cameras zoomed in, catching her steady breath, the way she folded her hands together as if drawing strength from some hidden well. Across the aisle, a colleague cleared his throat, perhaps hopping to defuse the moment, but Mace was not finished. She spoke again, painting a picture of federal dollars wasted on programs she framed as divisive. She warned of classrooms indoctrinating children to see enemies in their neighbors, her tone rising with each example. The more she talked, the clearer it became that this was no policy critique. It was an indictment of the very idea that privilege could shape opportunity. Social media feeds began to glow with fragments of the exchange, clips uploaded in real time. A trending tag appeared within minutes, speculation bubbling as users debated whether Mace's remark had crossed an uncrossable line. Screenshots of Crockett's calm expression flooded timelines, paired with captions that urged patience or promised a reckoning. Outside the chamber, phones vibrated on desks, journalists receiving alerts that the hearing was veering into combustible territory. Inside, the air thickened. Even those who agreed with Mace seemed unsettled by the bluntness of her words, by the ease with which they stripped away layers of decorum. Crockett felt the shift. This was no longer about budgetary oversight or educational frameworks. It was a confrontation over dignity itself, over whether one group's comfort outweighed another's right to name the obstacles in their path. She exhaled slowly, meeting Mace's stare with a composure that felt almost defiant. The next move would decide whether the hearing spiraled into hostility or transformed into something sharper, more revealing. And in that fragile pause, every eye turned toward her, waiting to see how she would answer the challenge laid so publicly at her feet. Nancy Mace did not arrive at this hearing as an unknown. Her career had been sculpted carefully, a study in contrasts that once won admirers across party lines. She spoke often of growing up on South Carolina's coast, the daughter of a military family that prized grit and loyalty. In her early years, she positioned herself as a pragmatic reformer, sharp-witted, driven, ready to challenge complacency wherever she found it. Her first campaign videos showed a young lawmaker walking along Charleston's harbor at dawn, sleeves rolled up, talking about the need for common-sense solutions. Voters loved the image, a woman who could temper ambition with poise. Yet behind that sheen lay a record that told another story, one written between headlines and committee votes. As her star rose, Mace discovered that defiance played well with an audience hungry for culture war champions. She began to sharpen her rhetoric, framing debates over equity and representation as existential battles for the nation's soul. Early speeches that spoke of bridging divides gave way to interviews where she dismissed conversations about systemic racism as political theater. She scoffed at reports on redlining or wage gaps, suggesting they were relics of a past long overcome. To her followers, this candor was refreshing. To critics, it was a refusal to confront enduring injustice. Her climb was marked by tactical reinvention. When national tensions swelled over police accountability, she appeared on morning shows urging calm. Yet weeks later, she co-sponsored measures that blunted even modest reforms. She would praise diversity at a press conference, then mock equity bureaucracy in closed-door meetings. That duality became her signature: polished civility when cameras demanded restraint, sharper barbs when rally crowds roared for clarity. Each turn bought her applause from different corners, but it also stitched together an identity increasingly tied to rejecting narratives about privilege. Behind closed doors, staffers whispered about a calculation driving her choices. Mace understood that skepticism of racial equity resonated with donors and talk radio hosts. She positioned herself as the one who could voice discomforts others kept hidden, an emissary for people who felt accused by progress. That strategy made her a fixture on cable panels and earned her a following large enough to insulate her from gentle rebukes inside her party. But it also tethered her to a message that grew more brittle as national conversations evolved. There were moments when the weight of that posture flickered through her speeches. A pause too long before answering a question about housing disparities, an awkward smile when journalists pressed for evidence behind sweeping claims, tiny cracks in the armor of composure. Still, she pressed forward, convinced that holding the line against what she called guilt-driven politics would define her as principled rather than obstinate. Each new controversy seemed to confirm the choice. Each viral soundbite tightened the knot between her reputation and resistance. By the time she took her seat at the equity hearing, that knot had become a lifeline and a trap. Supporters expected her to stand firm against anything resembling an apology for America's past. They shared clips of her calling affirmative action a crutch, hailed her quips about woke spending, and urged her to speak harder truths. Mace, ever alert to her audience, prepared remarks designed to pierce through bureaucratic calm. But she also knew the stakes. One misstep could turn a carefully curated persona into a cautionary tale about ambition over reach. This tension framed every gesture that morning: the tidy stack of notes, the deliberate cadence of her voice, the steady glance toward cameras recording her words. She sought to embody reasoned skepticism, but the hearing's subject carried layers she could not fully script away. White privilege was not a budget item or a procedural motion. It was a mirror some were reluctant to face. Mace had built a career deflecting that mirror, arguing that fairness meant moving past grievances. The question was whether that argument could withstand a setting where facts and lived experiences waited, ready to challenge each dismissive phrase. As she settled back after her incendiary line, the room seemed to weigh her story as much as her statement. Years of maneuvering had led her to this juncture, a place where one sentence could solidify her standing or expose the limits of polished defiance. Across from her, Jasmine Crockett studied the Congresswoman not merely as an opponent, but as a symbol of something larger, the comfort of narratives that erased uncomfortable truths. The silence stretched, thick with the sense that history had drawn two clear roles, and the next exchange would reveal which one would endure beyond the hearing's walls. Jasmine Crockett's path to the halls of Congress was never paved with shortcuts. She was raised in a working-class family that believed in persistence over privilege, a household where evenings were filled with the hum of radios tuned to community updates and the steady encouragement of parents who wanted their daughter to outgrow every limitation they had known. School was both refuge and proving ground. Teachers noticed early how she absorbed details others skimmed past, how she defended classmates when rules felt unevenly applied. That instinct, to stand steady when fairness wavered, became the quiet motor of her life. When she left for college, she carried more than textbooks. She carried the hopes of neighbors who saw in her a chance to widen the horizon for the next generation. She majored in political science, but it was the campus debates over justice and belonging that sharpened her focus. Nights spent in crowded lecture halls, mornings volunteering at legal clinics, each experience stitched into her a conviction that laws should protect rather than intimidate. She earned a reputation for listening closely, then speaking with a precision that made people pause, even if they disagreed. Law school tested that resolve. Surrounded by students from pedigreed families, Crockett often felt the weight of being underestimated. She answered by outworking everyone, poring over case law until the library lights dimmed. Her professors came to rely on her clarity during discussions about civil rights precedents. She didn't romanticize the system. She studied its cracks, determined to widen them into entry points for people too long locked out. Internships with public defenders exposed her to courtrooms where outcomes hinged less on guilt or innocence than on resources and assumptions. Those encounters burned into her memory, guiding every step that followed. After graduation, she returned home rather than chase prestige elsewhere. She set up a modest practice focused on defending tenants and workers who faced retaliation for speaking up. Her office was small, its walls lined with sticky notes and community flyers, but the phone never stopped ringing. She became known as the lawyer who didn't flinch when cases grew messy, who treated each client's story as part of a larger argument for dignity. Reporters covering housing disputes began quoting her explanations about how bias hides inside neutral-sounding policies. That attention brought invitations to advise city leaders, yet she kept her door open to the people who had trusted her first. The leap to public office grew out of frustration as much as ambition. Crockett watched state houses pass measures that chipped away at voting access and diluted school equity programs. Friends urged her to run, arguing that her voice could carry beyond courtrooms. Campaigning meant long days under summer sun, knocking on doors in neighborhoods that had heard too many promises. She spoke plainly, pledging to protect opportunity and to legislate with the same steadiness she brought to legal briefs. Voters responded not to theatrics, but to her steadiness, the sense that she wouldn't abandon principle when cameras turned away. Her election to Congress was a victory claimed inch by inch, built on coalitions of educators, union members, immigrant advocates, and young volunteers eager to see someone who reflected their persistence. In Washington, she arrived without the entourage of polished strategists common to first-term representatives. She kept her own calendar tight, preferring policy briefings over receptions, committee research over endless talk show slots. Colleagues learned that behind her calm exterior was an unshakable memory for details, and a readiness to challenge arguments that skimmed past lived reality. That discipline shaped how she approached contentious hearings. While others rehearsed barbed sound bites, she prepared questions layered with evidence, weaving stories of ordinary people into lines of reasoning impossible to dismiss. She treated the record as a living ledger of promises made to the public. When debates grew raucous, she anchored herself with slow breaths, speaking only when words could steady the room. It wasn't performance. It was how she had survived every arena where doubt tried to crowd her out. What distinguished Crockett most was the way experience and empathy fused in her bearing. She had walked beside parents fighting to keep children in schools that punished them more harshly than their peers. She had listened to job seekers explain how identical resumes yielded different futures depending on the name printed at the top. She had sat with families whose homes were appraised for less until a white friend posed as the owner. These encounters were not anecdotes for speeches. They were reminders of the distance still to travel between ideals and practice. On the morning of the hearing, she carried all of it quietly. While aides handed her briefing folders, she scanned the room, reading subtleties, the tension behind smiles, the undertone of impatience in whispered conversations. She understood that the dispute about racial equity programs would not remain confined to legislative language. It would surface every unspoken assumption about who deserved leniency, who earned suspicion, who was allowed to make mistakes without being defined by them. Crockett had been preparing for that conversation her entire life. So when Nancy Mace delivered her cutting remarks, Crockett's composure was not feigned. It was the product of years spent building a reservoir of clarity. She recognized the provocation, the invitation to lose control, and chose instead to wait, letting the moment breathe until its full weight revealed itself. The room saw stillness, but underneath was a precise readiness. The lawyer, the advocate, the congresswoman aligning to meet a challenge she knew would define more than just the outcome of a single debate. Nancy Mace leaned forward, her voice sharpening as though she'd been waiting for this exact moment. She framed the committee's equity proposals as an attack, calling them reverse racism, her tone pitched to inflame. Each word was crafted to sound righteous while undermining years of painstaking reform. The room shifted, aides stiffened, pens froze mid-note. The cameras, already trained on the table, adjusted focus, zooming in to capture the glint in Mace's eyes as she pressed her advantage. She spoke of level playing fields, insisting the real victims were those burdened by programs that tilt the scales for political correctness. The phrasing landed like a gauntlet thrown across the chamber floor. On the dais, members exchanged wary looks. Some concealed smiles behind folded hands, pleased to see the argument turn combative. Others bristled, knowing how easily her language could rip open old wounds. In the audience, murmurs rolled through rows of activists and staffers, a low tide of disbelief. Crockett sat motionless, fingers laced on the desk before her. Her eyes tracked Mace with unwavering focus, absorbing each phrase without flinch. She understood the tactic: provoke, distort, repeat. It was a strategy honed in 100 culture war skirmishes, meant to corner reformers into defensive crouches. Yet Crockett's stillness hinted at something else, a discipline born of every courtroom where she'd learned that timing could shift the ground beneath an opponent's feet. Mace sensed the silence and pressed harder. She painted a portrait of struggling families penalized by inclusion initiatives, warning that good intentions don't excuse discrimination. She gestured toward data sheets stacked before her, never glancing down, her delivery rehearsed to sound spontaneous. Applause rippled from a cluster of spectators aligned with her cause, breaking the committee's decorum for a heartbeat before fatting under the chair's gavel. Cameras tracked the tension like predators scenting a turning tide. A broadcast light blinked red, signaling a live feed now centering the exchange. On social channels, clips began to circulate within seconds, captions framing the clash as a referendum on justice itself. The air grew dense with expectation, every breath in the chamber syncing to an invisible metronome of conflict. Crockett finally moved, only slightly, adjusting a single page in her binder. The gesture was quiet but deliberate, a signal to anyone watching closely that she was far from rattled. Her eyes met Mace, across the table, steady and unblinking. She let the echo of reverse racism settle into the corners of the room, where interns and journalists scribbled, knowing they were witnessing more than legislative routine. Mace, interpreting composure as weakness, launched into anecdotes meant to puncture the legitimacy of equity programs. A college applicant denied for checking the wrong box, a contractor losing bids to quotas. Her tone hardened, shifting from critique to indictment. "What we see here," she declared, "is government-sanctioned bias, and it has to stop." She allowed the last words to hang, savoring their weight. Around them, the audience tensed. Supporters of reform exchanged uneasy glances, sensing how neatly her rhetoric played to resentment. Some activists clasped their hands, whispering encouragement under their breath, as if sending strength across the room. Reporters leaned forward, pens poised, ready to chronicle either a capitulation or a countermove worthy of tomorrow's headlines. But Crockett remained anchored. She had weathered sharper storms than this, both in court and in life. Her silence wasn't absence. It was a gathering of force, a careful calibration of language to come. She understood that one misstep, one reactive word, could reduce years of coalition building to a sound bite. The discipline in her posture carried its own narrative, a refusal to meet provocation on the ground where it thrived. The chair attempted to steer the discussion back to procedural notes, but the effort was fragile. The room's attention clung to the magnetic pull between the two lawmakers, aware that the next exchange might redraw the boundaries of the debate entirely. Mace shuffled her notes with theatrical precision, preparing another salvo. She smelled an opening, convinced that if she kept pressing, Crockett would break. Instead, Crockett leaned back slightly, the faintest smile tracing the corner of her mouth. It wasn't amusement, it was recognition, the calm before choosing a line that could shift the narrative. The audience sensed it, a collective intake of breath as if the chamber itself understood that the clash had reached its hinge. The stakes, once abstract, now felt personal to everyone watching, an argument about who counted, whose future mattered, whose story would define the record. The cameras caught the moment in exquisite detail. Mace poised mid-attack, Crockett balanced in quiet readiness, the crowd suspended between outrage and hope. Whatever happened next would leave a mark larger than any single hearing, a turning point etched into the memory of everyone present, waiting for the first word of Crockett's reply. Crockett straightened in her chair, the faintest inhale steadying her frame. She didn't rush. The room, still vibrating from Mace's assault, felt like a drum waiting for a measured strike. Her voice, when it came, was low but resonant, the kind that made people unconsciously lean closer. "Congresswoman," she began, "I want to address the heart of what you've said." She paused just long enough to reclaim the tempo. "You framed equity as a burden, as if fairness is some tax on those who already have it good. But I need us to deal in facts, not fears." She opened a folder with unhurried precision, sliding a page forward. "Here, a case study. A 14-year-old white student was caught on school grounds with a loaded handgun. He was suspended for 5 days. No charges, no record. A few months later, in another district, a 12-year-old black student showed up with a plastic water gun. He was handcuffed, taken to the station, and flagged in the juvenile system. Same state, same year." Her gaze swept the committee table. "Tell me that isn't about who we see as a threat." A hush settled over the room. Even the clicking of reporters' keyboards slowed. Crockett flipped to another sheet. "Let's look at hearing. A national study sent out thousands of identical resumes. The only difference, the names. One sounded traditionally white, the other black. The callback rate for the white-sounding name was 46%. For the black-sounding one," she let the number fall like a pebble into still water, 14%. Mace shifted slightly, crossing one leg over the other. Her expression froze somewhere between defiance and discomfort. Crockett didn't exploit it. She simply kept laying stones across the river. In housing, she lifted a photograph, a tidy brick home, flower pots on the porch. A black family asked for an appraisal. Their home was valued at $110,000. Later, they invited a white friend to pose as the owner with the same house, the same furniture, the same everything. The new appraisal, her eyes met Mace's. $160,000. Gasps whispered across the gallery. A staffer near the back lowered his phone mid-text, starring as if seeing something unspoken become undeniable. Crockett let the silence breathe, granting the facts room to settle inside every listener. These aren't stories pulled from some theory, she continued. They're data points lived out in classrooms, offices, neighborhoods. They explain why programs you dismiss as handouts are, for many, the only guardrails keeping bias from swallowing opportunity. She leaned forward, hands folded loosely. White privilege isn't about guilt. It's about the privilege to be forgiven when you are wrong. To walk into a room and be seen as a person first, not a problem waiting to be solved. A ripple ran through the chamber, quiet, electric. On the dais, a member cleared his throat, then stopped, as if words would cheapen the gravity. Cameras zoomed closer, framing Crockett's calm face against the tension thickening in the air. Mace tried to interject, but her voice caught on the edge of Crockett's composure. "That's not," she began, only to falter as Crockett turned toward her, eyes steady, almost kind. There was no malice there, only the weight of someone unwilling to abandon truth for comfort. "This isn't about blaming anyone for the past," Crockett said softly. "It's about recognizing the present and deciding if we're brave enough to do better." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Even the chair seemed hesitant to breathe. The audience sat transfixed, every face reflecting some flicker of reckoning, anger, hope, shame, resolve. The live feed carried their silence out to millions of viewers, an unplanned chorus amplifying the moment. Then Crockett's gaze tightened, just enough to sharpen the room's focus. "You ask why people fight for equity," she said, voice gathering quiet force. "Because when systems excuse one child with a weapon but criminalize another with a toy, when resumes are judged by who they imagine you to be, when your home's value depends on the color of the hand answering the door, that's not fairness. That's a mirror showing us who we really are." She paused, allowing her words to unfurl across the hall. "And if that makes us uncomfortable," she added, "maybe discomfort is where honesty begins." Mace shifted again, the confident tilt of her chin slipping by degrees. The committee chamber felt smaller, as if the walls themselves were leaning in, pressing for clarity. Crockett looked down briefly, as though gathering a final thought, then met the room head-on. "America doesn't need to apologize for white privilege," she said, each syllable deliberate. "It needs to see it, name it, and decide whether we're brave enough to move past it together." A tremor passed through the gallery, half gasp, half sigh. Journalists glanced at one another, registering the sentence already writing itself into headlines. On social feeds, clips of her words burst into circulation, captioned with a single phrase, "The line." For an instant, time felt suspended. Mace's notes lay untouched on the table. Some committee members sat back, eyes wide, as if realizing they had just witnessed a fulcrum, a shift from debate to truth-telling that couldn't easily be walked back. The resonance of Crockett's voice lingered, heavier than applause, deeper than outrage. She didn't smile, didn't gloat. She let the silence hold, an invitation rather than a victory lap. Around the room, body language changed. Shoulders lowered, brows softened, pens lowered onto paper. Even those opposed to her politics seemed caught in the gravitational pull of her argument. And then gently, Crockett closed her folder. The motion released the room from its spell, but not from its reckoning. Eyes followed her as she settled back, unhurried, the embodiment of a truth too steady to be drowned out. Beyond the hearing walls, the country was already reacting. Phones buzzing, posts multiplying, conversations sparking in living rooms and offices. But inside, in that breathless pause, only one certainty remained. Nothing about the debate would ever feel small again. The hearing had barely adjourned when the clip detonated across every platform. First came a shaky phone recording on X, captioned with a single word, "Wow." Within minutes, the official feed posted the moment in crisp HD, and the algorithm pounced. Hashtags bloomed like fireworks. #Crockett mic drop, truth in one line, equity matters, stacking one atop another until the trending sidebar looked like a tribute wall. TikTok stitched Crockett's words over slow-motion replays of Mace's startled blink. Creators added subtitles in bold, staccato fonts. "See it. Name it. Move past it." A teacher in Detroit posted from her classroom, tears in her eyes as she described a student disciplined for defending himself while another, with the right last name, walked away unscathed. "This is what she meant," the teacher said, pointing to the quote behind her on the smartboard. On YouTube, commentators unpacked the exchange frame by frame. One channel titled its analysis, "When Calm Power Wins," cutting between Crockett's measured delivery and Mace's tightening jawline. Another offered a montage of public figures nodding along to her words, activists, scholars, even a few centrist pundits who rarely waded into racial debates. They all agreed on one thing: something seismic had just been said, and said well. Parents began sharing their own quiet reckonings. A mother in North Carolina recounted how her black son was suspended for defiance after questioning an unfair rule, while a white classmate who cursed at the same teacher received only a warning. A father in Oregon described an appraisal on his mixed-race family's home that mysteriously leapt in value once his wife handled the paperwork alone. Each story arrived like a ripple, converging into a tide that pushed Crockett's testimony far beyond Capitol Hill. News outlets joined the swell. Headlines ranged from sober, "Crockett challenges Mace with data on bias," to sensational, "The one line that shook the house." Cable shows queued up side-by-side footage, pitting Mace's accusations against Crockett's unflinching clarity. Late-night hosts spliced the quote into punchlines, but even their jokes bent toward respect. Audiences laughed, then replayed the segment, struck by how serious the laughter felt. Meanwhile, Mace's office issued nothing. For 7 days, her social feeds went silent, an absence louder than any rebuttal. Commentators speculated about strategy, but the vacuum only magnified Crockett's resonance. While Mace stalled, Crockett's staff carefully amplified her message without theatrics, posting links to the studies she'd cited, encouraging viewers to read for themselves. "Facts don't fade," one tweet read. "Neither should our courage." By the weekend, rallies had woven her line into handmade banners. At a march for school equity in Chicago, children held cardboard signs that read, "See it, name it, move past it." College students adopted the phrase as a chant at orientation events, tying it to panels on bias and belonging. Even faith leaders quoted it in Sunday sermons, framing it as an invitation to humility and repair. Across the digital landscape, remix artists layered her sentence over swelling instrumentals, crafting short reels that turned the moment into an anthem. One edit showed faces from every background: teachers, nurses, warehouse workers, holding up placards with their own stories of overlooked potential. Each clip ended the same way, Crockett's voice echoing, steady as a drumbeat. "America doesn't need to apologize for white privilege. It needs to see it." By Monday morning, mainstream polls registered a measurable bump in awareness about systemic bias. Talk radio callers debated whether privilege was real or just political theater. But even skeptics quoted her words verbatim, proof that they had stuck. In high schools from Phoenix to Philadelphia, civics teachers scrapped lesson plans to stream the exchange, pausing to let students argue, empathize, or sit in reflective quiet. Crockett herself declined the temptation to grandstand. She appeared briefly on a morning show, thanking viewers for listening with open minds. "This isn't about me," she said. "It's about whether we're brave enough to recognize what's been right in front of us." Her calm set a tone, signaling that the viral moment belonged to everyone willing to engage with its substance. As the week closed, think pieces speculated about a Crockett effect, the power of precision over volume, of data wielded with empathy rather than venom. The conversation had expanded, drawing in voices long relegated to the margins. For once, the country wasn't merely talking about division. It was weighing a way forward, fragile but possible. And somewhere beneath the noise, the image endured. A poised congresswoman, spine straight, words carved clean through the fog. Beyond the trending tags and late-night segments, a deeper current stirred, one that asked whether America might finally be ready to meet truth without flinching. The next step, everyone sensed, would demand more than applause. For 7 days, Nancy Mace said nothing. Her social feed stayed frozen, Press aides ducked questions, and a hollow quiet clung to her name in the headlines. That pause, meant perhaps to cool the fire, instead drew a sharper outline around what had happened. Silence became a mirror, reflecting how brittle certainty can feel after truth has landed. Jasmine Crockett, meanwhile, never raised her voice, never rushed to claim the spotlight. She let her words breathe, appearing only to remind people why she'd spoken at all. On a morning broadcast, she offered a single sentence that echoed beyond policy or party. America doesn't need to apologize for white privilege. It needs to see it, name it, and choose courage. She said it plainly, as though inviting the nation to look itself in the eye. The power of that line was not in scolding, but in its steadiness. It invited reckoning with outrage, a challenge braided with grace. Viewers who'd first come for the drama found themselves caught by its undertow, considering how often decency is built on the quiet labor of numbing what's hard to face. Teachers pinned the quote above whiteboards. Parents repeated it at dinner tables, trying to translate its weight for children just old enough to ask why fairness sometimes bends. Even those uneasy with the phrase white privilege found something undeniable in Crockett's composure. Her message wasn't about assigning shame, it was about widening vision. She spoke of empathy as a civic skill, one that demanded honesty, not humiliation. In that framing, equity stopped feeling like a courtroom verdict and began to resemble an open door. Across the country, small acts sprouted where applause had ended. A school board in Ohio scheduled a workshop on implicit bias. A tech company's hearing panel quietly rewrote its screening guidelines. A pastor in Georgia preached on courage as seeing your neighbor's burden and refusing to look away. None of these gestures trended, but together they hinted at an answer to the question Crockett had left hanging. What do we do after truth breaks the surface? For some, the lesson was personal. It asked them to pause before dismissing someone else's experience, to imagine what it costs to keep explaining the same wound. For others, it was systemic, about policies that had been treated as favors rather than course corrections. But for everyone, the thread was the same. Courage isn't a roar. It's a steady gaze that won't blur the picture just because it's inconvenient. Mace's week of silence ended with a brief statement, careful and clipped. She insisted her concern was about curriculum overreach, not identity. But by then, the country's attention had drifted past defensiveness toward something more constructive. The viral moment had shifted from sparring match to moral inquiry, and Crockett's calm clarity had set the tone. In that shift lay the real victory, not for one lawmaker over another, but for a public reminded that decency can carry weight heavier than derision. The hearing, for all its theater, had offered a rare civics lesson, that dignity is persuasive, and evidence offered with respect can pierce the armor of denial. As the sun set on a week of debate, the clip kept circulating, but now less as spectacle and more as guidepost. Viewers shared it with captions like "Let be this brave," or "This is the America we're still capable of." It wasn't blind optimism, it was a quiet wager on character. And that perhaps was Crockett's lasting gift, not just the precision of her rebuttal but the invitation stitched inside it. To see what is real, to name what has lingered unnamed, to choose courage, not once but over and over until equity feels less like an argument and more like common sense. Somewhere beyond the trending charts, that invitation waited, asking who would accept it next.